Yesterday, we had a session on the internet, this new Godzilla amongst our midst, a medium in which we are all converging. Every aspect of our lives is converging. Yesterday, we spoke of the political aspect of it, its power, and how we can control it. Today, we have the world's most respected sociologist of the internet, somebody who began to think about it in 1984, when I could wager that almost nobody in this room either had access to the internet or even knew it existed. Back then, Sherry Turkle had already written a book called The Second Life in 1984. Since then, she's written several books. She has been thinking deeply, not about the politics of the use of the internet, but of its sociological and psychological impacts on us across generations, we as parents, as grandparents, and as children. What is this medium turning us into? Who are we becoming? How is it mutating the human race? Please welcome Sherry Turkle.
How much wood would a woodchuck chuck if a woodchuck could chuck wood?
It depends on whether you were talking about African or European woodchucks.
By the time you're grown up, I'll be as smart as a real person.
怒って悲しんで
little film clip, that we are trying to humanize our technology even as we begin to dehumanize ourselves. And that, in fact, is the real heart of Sherry's argument. Sherry, I'd like to start with, back in 1984, as I said, I think in India we had no access to the internet. What made you already begin to think so deeply about it? What were the signs in 1984 that it would take over our lives?
Well, in 1984, what I saw then was the power of the one-on-one relationship of people and their computers. The name of my first book was The Second Self, Computers and the Human Spirit. So I was a humanist who took a job at MIT to teach the relationship between Freud and artificial intelligence, because I saw a lot of connections between these two different models of mind that both had aspirations to kind of create a vision of the human mind, one kind of about meaning and the other about mechanism. So studying people and computers was the furthest thing from my mind until I met the first hackers who really saw their minds as machines. And I remember teaching my first class, it's got to have been in the first week of my being there, and I said something like, we're talking about Freud's idea of a slip, where he talks about the chairman of a meeting declaring a meeting closed. And I talked about how he thinks that's because there's meaning in that slip, that the chairman doesn't want to be there. And this hacker said, no, that's a computer error. A bit has been dropped. There's been a power surge, no problem. And I realized that there was this new way that he thought about his mind in terms of debugging, in terms of power surges, in terms of bits and bytes. And he saw his mind as a computer, and I just began to study kids and those first electronic toys and games, Merlin, Simon, Speak and Spell. And I was lucky because I was in the right place at the right time to see the intensity, the eroticism, the passion that we form with this new technology. And then I just kind of studied it out from there.
So in those early years, Sherry, I was reading somewhere that you were extremely celebratory about it.
Yes.
You were exhilarated by it and
Yes.
what it was doing to our psychology
Yes.
and our potencies. Recently, your vision has got a bit darker. You're more
Yes.
worried now. What's transpired? What has got you so worried?
Yes. Well, in those early days, so I began in the late 70s, early 80s, and I studied first the one-on-one of us and those early personal computers, and I saw how it changed our identity. And then in a book in 1995, I took it from the one-on-one and I went to how the internet was changing our identities. I studied the early communities on the internet where people took on avatars, played other than themselves. And I celebrated this as a place where people could experiment with identity. And as a psychologist, I thought this was incredibly fascinating because it was a place where I saw people, I'm an ethnographer and a clinician, and I saw that people could experience playing with identity and really using what they learned online to live better lives in the real. And I celebrated that. But then the situation turned darker. That was in 95. And the situation turned darker, and I'm an honest researcher, because the book came out in 95, Life on the Screen, and I saw two things in 95, 96 that I hadn't seen before. First, mobility. That when I talked about this flourishing of identity, my model was that you sat in front of a computer, you experimented with identity, and then you got up and you brought that experimentation into the rest of your life. But once people were holding their phones all the time and moving in and out of computer space all the time, they sort of were in and out of their computer identity and leaving the people they were with all the time. And I began to develop this notion of alone together, where we were never completely present to our reality, to our real reality. And I began to develop that. And then the second thing that I saw that literally hadn't been on the scene in the early 90s when I wrote Life on the Screen were sociable robots. And that's why I loved your film about me, because I began to study a new kind of robot, which had not been on the scene earlier, a robot that doesn't try to be smart, but tries to make you think it loves you. And it looks you in the eye, it gestures in your direction, it knows your name, it doesn't really have anybody home, but by doing these very simple things, it presses your Darwinian buttons, and it makes you feel that there's somebody home. And is the way we're built, that as soon as these Darwinian buttons are pressed, we feel that it cares for us, and if it asks us to nurture it, we love what we nurture. We nurture what we love, but we love what we nurture. And I saw how vulnerable we are, and I began to study these robots, which are used in Japan, for example, very heavily as elder care bots and as nanny bots, and that are being developed and that are coming. And I'm very disturbed about this because really they are making a bid to be creatures for us to attach to, and I found that very dark. So this is a darker book because I think that both of these trends, number one, to have us form attachments to computers that do not deserve our love, and also the fact that we're leaving ourselves alone together, are both things that we need to just pay attention to.
Sherry, I'll come back to this idea of machines supplanting our humanness, because there are other cutting-edge thinkers like Ray Kurzweil, for instance, who
Yes.
believes that that is the inevitable next evolutionary step,
Yes.
that we become machines, in fact. And we'll come back to that. But what do you think it is that is making us want to sublimate the mess of human relationships with the, clinical control we can have over machines? I mean, what's the beauty and what's the attraction of having humanized machines around us rather than human beings? There has to be a seduction in it,
Well, there are many aspects to the seduction. First of all, let's just take why we'd rather text than talk. When I ask people, there's a kind of flight from conversation. When I ask people, why don't you want to have a conversation? They say, I'll tell you why I don't want to have a conversation. You aren't in control of what you're going to say. You don't know when it's going to end. And you can't hide your real feelings. So what technology allows us to do is to have the illusion of companionship without the demands of intimacy. Now, if you're lonely but afraid of intimacy, as so many people are, that's not like only a few people are. That's a lot of people are. That's very heady stuff. So that's a very seductive thing, to be able to text, not talk.
To be able to control how much emotion...
To be able to control. Control is the essence of why it is so seductive to be able to mediate our relationships through machines. We can control how much we show. We can sort of hide in plain sight. I interview a 50-year-old businessman who says he doesn't have relationships at work. He really doesn't have colleagues anymore. He says, he just does everything, through email. People are too busy. And then he says, I'm lying. I'm the one who doesn't want to talk to people. I'd rather just do everything on my BlackBerry because I can control what people see.
But Sherry, I have to say I'm not a very technology-friendly person, you know. Anytime any technological object comes into my hand, it malfunctions, you know.
Yeah.
But just to play devil's advocate, why is it a bad thing? You know, it's not that the human world or the world of the flesh is an entirely benign place. There are very lonely people. There are imperfect relationships. You know, if you're living out a different life on the net, human race has been changed by different inventions. You know, why is this necessarily a bad thing?
Well, you know, I think we have to figure out, Ray Kurzweil is a close friend, and he and
We'll have to get him for us next year.
He and I make for an interesting dynamic duo, and he and I have had this conversation for 20 years. I mean, you have to figure out, from my point of view, I watch mothers in playgrounds who are not looking at their children as they are immersed in what's on their phones. I watch people at funerals who are texting. And I ask them, why are you texting? And they're very honest. They say it's boring. And, you know, funerals, I think it's a good example for your question because, you know, funerals are boring. And the question is, why do we want to go to funerals and pay attention to the boring bits? And I think it's because it says something about being in a human community. And that we want to show our children that we're in a human community and we pay attention to the boring bits because that's a value. We're in our bodies, and part of our legacy is that we care about conversation and not just connection. So one of the things that I think is happening, to answer your question, is that there is a movement from conversation to connection. And if we don't watch it, we will forget the difference between conversation and mere connection. And we'll forget that there's a difference, and we'll forget what we're losing. And one of the things that we're losing is the sense of human attachment, the kinds of attachment and multi-layers that you lose when you have bodies in the room. I live in Boston. You brought me a long way, you know, to actually meet you.
Through a hurricane.
And through hurricanes and flying all around. And I came a long way to actually meet. I've met some extraordinary people here. I've only been here a couple of days, and it's been precious. So the question is, what is the value of that? You know the value of that.
No, but Sherry, that's not a good example because actually the internet has enabled us to know you. Otherwise, before that, I wouldn't have known you existed mostly.
It's a perfect example. The value of the internet is that you got to know me on a certain level. And now having me here, you're going to get to know me on another level. And so I absolutely refuse to be classed. I love the internet. I sleep with my iPhone. Before...
That's a good ménage à trois.
Before I have a daughter who I adore, before I give a talk, or, she knows when I'm doing something important, this is important to me. She texts me her special little good luck, Mom, you'll rock text. She did it this morning. She got up in an unearthly hour, to make sure she was synced with India. I mean, that's what the internet is great for. It's good for, and I think it's so important not to classify somebody like me who uses the internet, and I'm assuming, this can be beamed, or I don't know what you're doing. I mean, the internet is fantastic. But to really get to know someone, to have an intimacy of connection, to feel the multi-layers of nuance and understanding and authenticity, you want to be with someone face to face. You want to have a conversation face to face. Now, that doesn't mean that if we become friends, we don't want to be writing each other emails and texting and continuing and fantastic. But I think that when I see, and this is what I do for my day job, is going into families and watching parents having breakfast and dinner and texting while their children are complaining that they don't have their parents' full attention. Mothers texting while not looking at their kids in the park. Number of playground accidents are skyrocketing. I mean, these kids are not growing up feeling as though they're having their parents' full attention. We know something about human attachment, and I think that technology can make us forget what we know about life. And I think we know, and let me just say again, because I think it's so important, sort of if you remember one thing from my visit here, is that I think it is so important not to classify someone like me as a Luddite, a technology hater, somebody who wants to dismiss technology. I think we have time to make this technology something that enhances our human values, which means we have to say, what are our human values? What makes for good relationships among people? And then build the technology in ways that enhance that. Keep your phone, but maybe not during meals. Not in the kitchen, not my rules, not in the kitchen, not in the dining room, not in the car.
No, in fact, Sherry, you've put that really well, because the key part of human relationships, in fact, is the mess of it, and
Yes.
as you said, the boring bits, that's what makes us human, the duty that we owe each other,
Yes.
and to forget that duty is to stop being human,
Yes.
So I agree with you on that, but what about the new generation, Sherry? You and I still, I think I'm the last generation that still has a foot in the rural world and the urban world, a world where one still had lanterns and,
Right.
all of that. But there's a new generation that is growing up with this language, And one very interesting thing that you've said is that a lot of youngsters today feel that all the multiple identities that they play with on the net is kind of sits easy and in
Yes.
conjunction with their real selves. And in fact, their real self is just one more surface identity. It's not a unified being.
Yes.
Their online identities are as real.
Yes.
So what's happening with the new generation?
Well, a lot of things are happening with the new generation, but let me tell you a piece of hope. I mean, one of the things that I see happening is that I think that where I see hope with the new generation is that I think that, in a funny way, people who came to it late behave like, I like to say, behave like young lovers who were smitten and who were afraid that too much talking will spoil the romance. So it's like, as though we're going to have to give up our phones if we're critical of our phones, But I think that people who came to it and who take it for granted, in some ways are in a better position. They know they were ignored by their parents, and they maybe are in a better position to say, I don't want to ignore my children. They maybe are in a better position to say, I'm more willing to have an internet sort of a little internet Sabbath here, Sunday morning. Because we're not talking about giving it up. We're just talking about putting some parentheses around it when it makes sense. And one story I'd like to tell that I found very moving is that one of the low points in my research for me emotionally was giving one of the robots that was shown in the film was a robot baby seal. And I gave this robot in my research to an elderly woman who bonded to it and who began to tell it about the loss of her child. And she's talking to this robot about the loss of this child, and this robot knows from nothing. But it actually had convinced her by the things it could do that it understood something, that it had seduced her into thinking that it understood something of what she was saying. And everybody is saying, isn't this amazing? And I'm thinking, this is not amazing. This is so upsetting. This robot knows nothing of the arc of a human life. It doesn't know what its son is. It doesn't know what death is. It doesn't know what grief is. For me, it was a low point. And very shortly after that, I was interviewing a bunch of 8-year-olds about robots and giving robots to the elderly. And this 8-year-old boy said to me, who really knew a lot about robots. He built robots. He had this robot. He said, don't they have people for those jobs? And I thought to myself, if you're completely comfortable, as opposed to all these, medical directors in the nursing home who are like, oh my God, a robot who can, fake out an 85-year-old, this is fantastic. Here's an 8-year-old who knows how to build a robot, who knows that the robot knows from nothing because he knows how to build it. He says, don't they have people for this job? I don't want to give my grandmother this. This is not appropriate. So, insofar as I'm guardedly optimistic, I think it's because there may be a cycle in which, as we mature into this technology, we'll become more able to put it in its place. And that's kind of my mantra. It's not to reject it, it's not to not like it, it's to put it in its place. It's like when cars first came out, we didn't have rules of the road, we didn't have speed limits, we didn't have lanes, we didn't have airbags, we had nothing. We just had accidents. So why not give ourselves a little time to... We've had these things a very short amount of time. So why not give ourselves a little time to put this in its place?
Sherry, before we come back, because I think we still need to talk about the young a little bit more. But before we come back to the human end of the discussion, I'd like to go back to Ray Kurzweil and you.
Ray Kurzweil and me, the odd couple.
Odd couple. And we've been fascinated by Ray's arguments ever since we read of him in, I think it was a Time magazine cover, that spoke about how he says that it's an inevitability, I think by 2030, which is round the corner, that computers will...
2030.
Yeah, will eventually overtake the human brain, simulate all of the human brain, and actually we will integrate with machines, and that is the next evolution process. Let's assume he was here. How would he convince you on that?
He wouldn't convince me.
Okay, he would argue with you. Will you tell us about his arguments? And
Ray
first convince us and then make us disbelieve.
I see. So first you want me to play Ray Kurzweil? Oh, I love this. This is good.
Multiple identities,
Right. Well, Ray Kurzweil, who is really, he's the real deal. One wonderful thing about Ray Kurzweil, when he has the right, he has earned the right to his opinions with which I disagree, because he is the real deal in terms of scientific accomplishment. So it's not just kind of, somebody who...
It's not just a crack.
Well, he's a truly distinguished scientist. He's a truly distinguished scientist. There's hardly anything in any piece of electronics that matters, in any piece of digital electronics that matters, that Ray Kurzweil didn't invent.
Sherry, your praise is sounding like the sharpening of the knife.
Yes,
before you go
I'm
for the
sure.
kill.
No. I mean, because I think that matters. I think that matters because there are plenty of people who say all kinds of things who don't earn the right to say it. So I think that's very important about Ray Kurzweil, and I think that's why his ideas coming from somebody else, I don't think would make the cover of Time magazine, quite frankly. Because then he goes on to say something that really sounds out of the Christian tradition, like the rapture, which is that in 2030, and he gets to this date in a very specific way by charts, and I mean, let me tell you, 2030, when it comes, and if we're all around, I'm having dinner with Ray Kurzweil on January.
On 2030.
We have a date on 2030. We will reach a point that he calls the singularity, and the singularity is a moment when the intelligence of artificial creatures, and he calls them creatures because he does believe that by that point they are creatures, reaches a level where there's a kind of inflection point where the linear no longer obtains, and they take off to a point where they're kind of in a different dimension. And it's not that we do their bidding, but they are so much different in magnitude in terms of their intelligence in relation to us, that if we don't meld with them, if we choose not to merge with them, we will become kind of, those who don't will become kind of their pets. So it isn't as though there may not be people who will choose not to join their intelligence with computers, but they will be, in terms of their capacity to live in the society, kind of like a pet. And that is, and that is just because, literally, because of the level of intelligence and capacity of the new creatures that will be here on the planet. And that moment is the singularity. And he uses this quasi-religious metaphor on purpose because it is kind of a new, it is more like a religion than it has that kind of religious tone to it because it's both a scientific moment and a moment when you really have to change your sense of human identity and give up your sort of your attachment to human identity and be willing to become something else, be willing to become he calls it species chauvinism, if you really are attached to any sense of human identity.
Sherry, you've done a great job of articulating someone's views that you so heartily disagree with, So now tell us, now that we've understood what he says, why do you believe that humanity will continue to assert itself against the advent of technology?
Well, I think that there's no... reason to think that we would want to evolve in this way. So I make a distinction, and as do many others, that there's another path that's equally probable, which is that for everything that involves medical usages, brain implants, if you have Parkinson's. And by the way, the path that I'm going to lay out makes us increasingly cyborg. So Ray's path is we become merged and not human anymore. My path is that we become, let's say we become human but cyborg. And by cyborg, I mean that we begin to take on more and more machine parts within ourselves as that becomes something that in many ways, for medical reasons, we start to feel it helps us and suits us, largely for medical reasons or for reasons that serve our human values. And the first ones, and most of those will be for medical reasons. So people with Parkinson's, I mean, it'll be the whole range of medical reasons. I mean, already people are walking around with I don't even know what you got, but I got some stuff,
Tell us.
Nobody, if we took a survey of the first 3 rows and people just called out what they have, we would find, a lot of
bits of machine,
a lot of bits and pieces, that we already have. Well, those bits and pieces will become.
I have a metal bit in my tooth.
You've got stuff in your tooth, I got stuff too, what I mean? So, but those pieces will become increasingly intelligent. We surely will have little robots that, for example, will be injected that will clean up the early signs of arteriosclerosis in our blood vessels, that will be smart, that will remove plaque. Who wouldn't want that? I mean, those things are in development. So that's artificial intelligence in our bodies. Now, will that make us robots? No. In my mind, that will make us artificially, intelligently enhanced people. And some people would say that makes us cyborg, and I'm completely comfortable with that. Now, you could see that going on, and increasing and increasing and increasing, and at some point, do you want to say that we stop being people? I don't think so, because I think that we will still be human beings who will make these decisions and who will say, we're people, but we're using the benefits of science to make ourselves enhanced people in the same way that people are using now prosthetic limbs that are so intelligent that that are so intelligent that they can receive signals from nerves and actually respond like legs. Now, who would not want that? Now, does that make you a robot? Does that make you not a human being? No. So I think the question is whether you make decisions and continue to think of yourself as a scientifically enhanced human being, or whether you use this other language that I think my path is equally probable. It does include a kind of evolutionary quality, but I think that it a little less sexy maybe in terms of, but I think it a little more probable. And Ray would say, and as he often has said, no imagination. You just have no imagination.
Left behind by time.
No. I'll see you in 2030.
Thank you, Sherry. You have to be here. after your January 1st meeting with him, 7 January, you have to be in India. You know?
I'll be back to Delhi. I'll tell you how it works out.
Last year, we had, another cutting-edge thinker, Gregory Stork, who spoke about how we can begin to design our babies, not just to be girls or boys, but actually to be sports stars or cinema stars, and even more disturbingly, to have qualities of empathy or of aggression. And it was one of the most earth-shaking talks from last year for me. And having you today speak, Sherry, about what technology can do to us and the ethical issues that face us has been absolutely fascinating. And I'm sure many of us here will join your tribe in the assertion of humanity.
No nanny bots, no elder care bots. Just say no.
And we didn't discuss the young enough, so we have to have you back soon, Sherry.
I'd love that.
Thank you.
Thank you.